a module called population genetics, but as it is a norm in every module, it is very important that we look at the description of the module and at the end of this particular module, what we expect to be able to understand as students, but also what we expect to practice. So this particular module explores the application of genetics principles to population. Therefore, you will gain a foundational understanding of how populations evolve over time, but also the factors influencing this process and the relevance of population genetics to population and reproductive health. You'll be able to understand the concepts that are here, especially in population genetics, that will equip you to evaluate genetic factors that influence health outcomes in different populations critically. And our learning objectives are that by the end of this particular module, you should be able to explain the core principles of the Mendelian genetics in the context of populations, but also you should be able to describe the mechanisms that generate genetic variations within the populations. You should be able to analyze the forces influencing allele frequencies in population, especially the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium and factors affecting it. But also you should be able to apply population genetic principles to understand the human genetic variations and disease patterns. You should be able to evaluate the impact of consanguinity to reproductive health, but also discuss the ethical considerations surrounding genetic testing in populations. And therefore, when you're able to understand, or by the end of this particular lecture or module, if you're able to understand these main want to go through the definitions and the basic concepts in population genetics. And when we're referring to population genetics to start with, we are meaning that this is a study of adaptation and disease susceptibility. In other words, the study of the structure of genes within the population helps us understand how and how these different genes are exposing people to certain diseases or is making them more resistant to certain diseases. Therefore, it mainly examines the frequency and the distribution of genetic traits, such as the alleles, the genes, and the genotypes within a population. So, if we're looking at probably the as we go ahead, as we go through the particular module, you'll be able to understand what we mean by an allele, what we mean by a gene, but also what mean by a genotype. So when we're referring to population genetics, we're looking at how all these traits are distributed within the population. And that leads us to a term called genetic variation. In other words, it refers to the differences in the DNA sequence among individuals within a population. This variation can arise through mutations, genetic drift, gene flow, and other mechanisms. In other words, we look at the fact that there is a difference in the DNA or in the genetic makeup of individuals within a population. Say other people have a different texture of the skin. Another population also has probably a brown, then a dark skin, a brown skin. So that is a genetic variation in there. But also, we want to look at an aspect called an allele, and we're saying an allele, they are different forms of a gene that occupy the same position on a chromosome. For example, a gene that determines the eye color may have two alleles, one for one for a blue, one for a blue eye, and one for a brown eye. So that is what we call an allele. That there are different forms of a gene. Just a moment here. That there are different forms of a gene that occupy the same position on a chromosome. So a gene that determines an eye color may have two alleles, one for the blue eye and one for the brown eye. So that is what we call a gene. In terms of art, we would refer to it as the texture color in there. And then we look at another term that is the genotype. When we're referring to a genotype, we're looking at an individual's genetic makeup, which is the combination of alleles that they possess. For example, an individual may have the genotype black or black-brown for the eye color gene. So a combination of these alleles is actually what we refer to as a genotype. Then a phenotype in other terms also refers to an individual's physical or behavioral characteristic, such as an eye color, height, or a skin color. So whereas a genotype is looking at the makeup, the phenotype is the physical appearance now, that someone now has an eye that is blue or an eye that is black. That is all originating from the concept of an allele to a genotype, then to a phenotype. Then another key term in this particular module that we're going to be looking at is what we call the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And this is a mathematical module that describes the genetic structure of a population in terms of allele frequencies and the genotype frequencies. It assumes that the population is large, randomly mating, and not subject to evolutionary forces such as natural selection or genetic drift. So, in other words, for it is looking at the frequencies between the allele and the genotype. But this is just a brief concept of the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. But it is an entire concept that we are going to look on throughout this module, and we shall be able to describe its theory very well, but also be able to understand its assumptions and its application. We will also want to describe what population is in this particular module. And simply would say that it's a group of individuals of the same species living in a specific geographical area. But in this aspect, we are looking at people of the same species, and we're looking at probably humans, animals, or I mean goats, with a population of goats. So these are individuals of the same species, but also who live in a specific geographical area there. Then there's what we call the gene pool, and when we're referring to a gene pool, we are saying that this is the total genetic information of a population, and that is in terms of what is the frequency of alleles and so forth and so on. The entire genetic information is what we call a gene pool. Pool coming from a combination such as a swimming pool, meaning a collective abstract that exists within a space. So that is what a gene pool means there. But also there's what we call an allele frequency, and we're saying this is the proportion of a specific allele in a population. And remember, when we were looking at allele, we could look at maybe the aspect of a black eye allele that is in there. So that the proportion of it or the number of it is what we are referring to as the allele frequency. But when we're looking at the Hardy Weinberg equilibrium, we shall be able to deeply look into this allele frequency. So we want to look at the distinction between what we call classical genetics but also what we refer to as population genetics. And we're saying that classical genetics focuses on the inheritance patterns of the individual traits, while population genetics examines the genetic structure of populations. And in other words, when someone asks you to look at classical genetics and population genetics, classical, we are only referring at the individual level. We're looking at the pattern, the inheritance pattern of individual traits, meaning we're looking at a single person in there. However, population genetics looks at the structure, the genetic structure that exists along that particular population. So, in other words, population genetics is concerned with understanding how genetic traits are distributed and evolve in the population over time. So, if we're looking at genes or that look at maybe black skin, then we are trying to look at in terms of population genetics. We shall be concerned with understanding how the black gene is distributed across the population. But at deeper, we shall be able to understand why it is very critical, especially in demography or even in reproductive health or even in the business world, why specifically we are interested in looking at the genetic patterns of population. The gist of population. We want to look at the applications in demography and reproductive health. We specifically want to look at how we are able to approach population genetics in regard to demography and reproductive health. So, we want to first look at genetic epidemiology, and we're saying genetic epidemiology is the study of the genetic factors that contribute to disease susceptibility and prevalence in populations. And therefore, it uses population genetics, so risk factors, and understand how they interact with environmental factors to cause disease. So, as a reproductive health student, you should be able to understand that the study of genetic factors helps to understand probably the risk factors that are associated probably to reproductive health related complications. For example, there are studies that have 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 it that probably the side effects of certain family planning methods are more prevalent within a certain genetic type of people or genetic group that is in there. So, being able to, in genetic epidemiology, which is the study of the genetic factors that contribute to disease susceptibility and prevalence in the population, you should be able to understand population genetic principles to identify the genetic risk factors. So you should be able to look at the distribution of a certain genetic composition within that population to be able to understand the risk factors that are associated to a particular disease pattern. For example, during the outbreak of COVID-19, when you are able to realize that there are more deaths that occur in the European area or within the white race, that genetic composition that make you more susceptible to COVID-19. But also, there is what we look at in regard to reproductive genetics. And in reproductive genetics, we examine the genetic factors that influence fertility and reproductive health. And it includes the study of genetic disorders that affect reproduction, such as infertility and birth defects. So there are certain birth defects, first like ectopic pregnancies. Pregnancies have been identified to be more common within the Asian races, and therefore, you as a reproductive health expert or student who has been able to go through this particular lecture of population genetics, you should be able to understand probably the risks that are associated with the reproduction within a certain race. Therefore, if you wanted to understand probably why certain reproductive health conditions occur, even race or the genetic composition should be able to give you an idea of probably why some are more prevalent within a certain race than the other races. So this is how the application of this particular population genetics can be able to be applied in reproductive health. But also there's what we call population screening, which involves testing a large number of individuals in a population for a specific genetic disorder or trait. It is used to identify individuals who are at high risk of developing a particular disease or condition. For example, we are looking at probably what reproductive disorder. We could look at prostate enlargement. So there are studies that could be done, or there are tests that could be done. You could test a larger population in a particular geographical area, and then be able to ascertain the risk that this population is more or is at a higher risk to developing prostate cancer or prostate enlargement because of gene compositions. And therefore, you're able to understand these conditions and be able to spread awareness on some of these issues. And then we look at genetic counseling. The genetic counseling is providing information and guidance to individuals and families about genetic risks and options. It helps individuals understand their genetic risks and make informed decisions about their reproductive health. So we've seen it with those who are sickle cellers. We've also seen those who have comorbidities being advised, and that is what we call the genetic counseling, where individuals, when population screening occurs, or when individual screening occurs, especially on their genetic composition for certain aspects, then you're able to advise them against the risks that might follow if they probably engaged in a reproduction or in a reproductive decision. Say side effects of certain family planning methods on people who have certain genetic compositions. We've seen that people who probably are considered obese reacting or having more side effects on certain family planning methods, probably that are hormonal, than those who might not be of that genetic makeup of obesity, or who might not be having that kind of makeup. So this can help you be able to do counseling to these individuals, and they can be able to make informed decisions about their reproductive health. Then how do we apply it in terms of demography? Population genetics helps us understand how genetic factors influence the population size and the structure itself. For example, the genetic factors can affect fertility rates, but also they can affect mortality rates and migration patterns, which in turn affect population growth or decline. So in our demography, you will be able to understand that probably there are certain races where the genetic composition probably we have seen genetic compositions where even reproduction takes place and people have triplets, people have quadruple children or productions. So these are all genetic compositions. And these genetic compositions or population genetics affect the fertility rates of a particular nation or of a particular community. So if you have a community where the twin births or the twin genes are predominant, then you should be able to plan or project a population increase in the shortest period possible. But also, if you have a gene, a population which has a genetic makeup of people who are probably in blood group A plus or those who are more susceptible to certain diseases, then it is very important that you're able to conduct a massive prevention or intervention, say an immunization campaign, because you've understood the genetic composition of this population and probably they are more susceptible to a certain disease. Say they are more susceptible to malaria, they are more susceptible to maybe other illnesses. Then you'll be able to take preventive measures to be able to help this community before they are messed up in getting those diseases. So that is how it is more applicable in there. But also you realize that it also affects migration patterns, and you realize that there are certain genetic makeups where the individual traits allow or make sure or force individuals to move to other places more often, or they are more chaotic, or they are more the genetic makeup makes them more chaotic, and in turn makes migration their routine. And therefore it is important that you're able to understand this, and then you know how they affect your population migration patterns, your population fertility rates, but also the mortality rates. Then we also have the migration and gene flow, where migration and gene flow refer to the movement of genes from one population to another. This can lead to changes in the genetic structure of the population, such as introduction of new alleles or the loss of the existing ones. And we've commonly seen this that there are certain societies, say the Arab, mostly the Indians, wanting to keep their race and not wanting to change genetic structures by not intermarrying with other people, and that is why they have policies that are stringent regarding intermarriages, because then these migrations can lead to gene flow or the change in the genetic structure. So you will realize that probably if the community was considered dark-skinned, for example, we Black Americans fighting for who said that initially America was for black men, but because of the infiltration, the Negroes or the black Americans, I'm not sure, but half castes, something like that. But all those are as a result of migration and gene flow. So it is important that as a demographer, you're able to understand some of these movements, because they can as well lead to genetic structures, changes in the genetic structures in the country, and affect both the health system but also the economy of the country. So as if you're not a demographer or you are an economist, you should also be able to take interest in understanding the population genetics, because then it also has an impact on the demand for your goods, because the interaction within genes then means that there is preference for certain food, there is preference for certain products, and there is variety in taste and preference. So if you're able to understand the dynamics of the population genetics in your society, then you'll be able to understand which products are able to be liked and then you tailor your marketing to that particular demand of that population in there. And we also have what we call assortative mating, which is how we can be able to apply population genetics in the field of demography. Assortative mating refers to the tendency of individuals to choose mates with similar genetic traits or characteristics. So this can lead to concentration of certain alleles in a population and affect the genetic structure of the population over time. So where individuals decide to be attracted to individuals of similar genetics or similar traits, then you will realize that probably you're producing either a gene that is improved, or you're producing a gene. There are different ways that it causes a lot of genetic changes within the country over time. So it is in our interest to understand the changes in this genetic structure over time. And as a demographer, that is why it's important. In other words, that's why race and marital status is always very important in understanding, or in our research studies that we conduct, because we want to understand the shift in these genetic compositions. And therefore, because they help us understand the changes over time. One, like we've discussed earlier on, it could affect the public health, but also it could affect migration patterns, it could affect mortality patterns, fertility patterns, but also the economy in terms of taste and preference, not only demand but also supply of certain goods and services. But also want to look again on reproductive health applications. The other side, we're looking at both demography and reproductive health. Then we've looked at reproductive health alone. We've looked at demography alone. Now we want to look at the aspect of reproductive health application of population genetics. And we're saying that genetic factors in infertility, that genetic factors can contribute to infertility in individuals and couples. Understanding the genetic causes of infertility can help identify individuals who are at high risk of experiencing infertility, but high eclampsia cases in very many health facilities. It is only very important that as a researcher, you're able to take interest. Once in a while, if you go to your health facility, you're able to identify, for example, when you're clocking your patient, you should be able to understand probably, or if you do a longitudinal study, meaning you're doing a review of literature, or you're doing a review of your data, if you looked at your hospital data regarding probably preeclampsia cases, or if you looked at miscarriages within your health facility, for those who work at a health facility, if you looked at the number of miscarriages that occur in a health facility, if you realize that they are more dominant in a certain probably, let's say, county or in a certain region, it is also important that whereas you could look at other factors such as the distance, such as the educational level, but also it is important that you look at the aspect of race of that particular community, so that you're able to understand probably the issues could be coming from risk that a certain particular race is at high risk of developing that particular condition of miscarriages. But also in business, it is very important that you take record of your customers who come, and you're able to understand which customer actually likes which product, or which customer mostly comes to buy which product. Then if you're willing to tailor your marketing information, then you're tailoring it according to your information and according to data that you already have because you will then be able to realize that actually, even if it is not race, it is people from this particular region that are coming to buy wheat from my shop, or it is people from this particular village that are mostly coming to buy wheat from my shop. So if you realize that there are more people coming to buy soap from the south, then it is only important that when you bring soap that has that has that is what people from the south like, you go ahead and take it down to them. You offer to them that outreach kind of services. Even similarly to health services, when you tailor or when you realize that the demand for your health services are coming from a certain region or from a certain village, then it is only important that you realize demand in that particular area is higher, and you tailor your services to that particular area. And lastly, for today, we want to look at genetic counseling for reproductive decisions, which we partly looked at. And we're saying genetic counseling can help individuals understand their genetic risks and make informed decisions about their reproductive health. It can include information about genetic testing, risk assessment, and reproductive options. So, mainly, this is the introduction I wanted us to have in regard to population genetics, so that tomorrow we are able to flow and run a little faster, because I am told you soon starting your exams. So, unless we have any questions on this introduction to population genetics that I have shared with us today. Anyone who has any questions? If we don't have questions, would like to end there for today. Yes, Thomas.